On this episode of Skeptiko, Alex talks with well-known author and consciousness explorer Peter Russel.
What this mind-brain duality, this consciousness issue really says is that, you know what, we really can't measure things the way that we thought we could.
Consciousness is absolutely fundamental. Without consciousness, there'd be no science. You could say it's the fundamental tool of science, and yet is totally ignored by science.
Stay with us for Skeptiko.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Tsakiris, and on this episode, Peter Russel joins us. Peter is a well-known author and thinker among people who are interested in human consciousness and science. It was a great pleasure to talk to him. Here's my dialogue. Today we welcome well-known author, teacher, and consciousness explorer Peter Russel to Skeptiko. Peter's books include The Global Brain, Waking Up in Time, and From Science to God. There are so many interesting things we might like to talk about today, so let's get right to it. Peter, thank you so much for joining me on Skeptiko, and welcome.
It's lovely to be with you.
You know, I have to say, the term pioneer gets thrown around a lot. But when it comes to your work with consciousness science, and particularly intersection of this idea of consciousness and spirituality, you really are a pioneer. I mean, you were in this so early. Tell us a little bit about that background and how you came to be such a prominent teacher, writer, and really put yourself out there in this area.
Yes, I mean, I think I became prominent just because, as you say, I was in there very early on when very few people were thinking this way, and it came out of a mixture of things in me. I was a scientist by inclination and by training. I'd gone to Cambridge University in England studying mathematics, probably one of the best places in the world you can study math. I was under Stephen Hawking's wing for a while. He was my tutor and loved it, doing theoretical physics, and then later moved into psychology. So I had that whole scientific training, which I really value and is still with me. I mean, people often diss science, but it's an incredible training in terms of just not only an understanding of the world, but how to look at the world. So that's one aspect of it. And then I also had an ongoing interest all my life in the mind and consciousness. As a teenager, I was doing things teenagers do, sort of, exploring self-hypnosis and flashing lights in front of my eyes and spinning round, just exploring altered states, just realizing, we can change the way we see things. And that led me into a reading of, well, in my teenage years, I was reading about yogis and things. But remember, this is back in the late 50s, early 60s, when the perceptions of yogis then were people who could lie on beds of nails or, swallow things and not be harmed by them.
Right.
Very different from the idea of yoga that's now become so widespread in the West. But so that interest was there, and that led me into an interest in Eastern philosophy and meditation. And I went out to India and studied meditation. At that time, I'd got involved in TM, transcendental meditation.
But Peter, hold on, let me interject here, because I think we all do this when we talk about our story and we try and weave together this tapestry. But there's a big shift there, right? And an interesting one I'd like to explore. So you're this Cambridge physicist, mathematician, science guy, as you describe in your book, From Science to God. You're just natural love and inclination to science. But you know that there is quite a schism a lot of times between the science types, the mathematics types,
yes,
and people who are traipsing off to India to explore what they're reading about yogis. It's wonderful. I get it. But I think that needs a little bit more filling in there.
Okay. I think the reason I began to sort of explore that more actively was a realization that physics wasn't going to answer everything. And one of the sort of, not quite an epiphany, but one of those moments of like little awakening was when I realized I could study hydrogen, solving the physics of hydrogen, which is a great intellectual achievement of Western science to actually solve Schrodinger's equation. And yet, the whole universe had evolved out of hydrogen, this, odorless, colorless gas. And here it had evolved into a being like me who could study hydrogen. I was like, what has happened here? How on earth did hydrogen evolve into a system that could study itself? And that just sort of blew my mind. And it was really like, how had consciousness come into existence in the universe? Why was it just a load of atoms evolving, molecules? You could even predict life, but why should life be conscious? Why was there consciousness in the universe in the first place? That was the question that really got me. It's the old sort of mind-brain problem. Why does the brain have a mind?
Yeah. But what I think is fascinating is you approached it from kind of this recursive scientific kind of mode, digging deeper and deeper into science. And I find that fascinating because for me, I really have come at it from a kind of a different perspective, totally different perspective, although I see the same things. I was really more, I guess, growing up, kind of more of an engineering-oriented, computer-oriented, entrepreneurial-oriented. I want to make money. I want to make things and make money. And as you describe in your book, you talk about your early just fascination with science, how sound travels through air, how metal expands.
Yeah.
That wasn't me. I never paid any attention to that. I was like, how can we go out and make a buck? But at the same time, I found the same kind of interest for me in yogic ideas or Eastern versus Western thought. But I just took at it from a very practical, well, is this right or is this right? What's the kind of most efficient? And kind of an engineering perspective. And I bring that up because in your book, you talk about your frustration with that we need new models for consciousness. And this is early on, as opposed to, I guess the way I always saw it is, hey, we got a paradigm that's broken here. It doesn't work anymore. It's no big deal. It's like AOL, we're both old enough to remember you've got mail, AOL. Yeah. I mean, it was the dominant paradigm and it's gone. It just disappeared. It's no longer AOL Time Warner. They even changed the name of that back. So I wonder if science has a harder time with these paradigm shifts. And even you, as much of a pioneer as you are, still looks for new models of consciousness rather than to say, oh, you know what? Science is broken. Science doesn't see that. It'll never see it. It's AOL. It'll be in the dustbin of history. Let's just move on.
Right. Yes, that's interesting. I think, whereas you were the engineer wanting to make things work, I wanted to understand things. And I wanted to understand the mind, understand consciousness. And I could see, the current scientific paradigm wasn't working. But what I wanted to do was find out what was the new paradigm? How could it interface with the old paradigm? So I think my path has been much more about understanding things and wanting to really dig in and how is it? How do things work? What does the new paradigm look like? And how can I share this with other people, what I'm seeing? So you were out probably making things, products, businesses. I was out sort of working with ideas, making books, that sort of thing.
So what did you find? What is the driving paradigm shift that you discovered?
For me, it's that consciousness is not something that's created by the brain. Clearly, the brain creates what we experience. If I'm seeing, a tree, it's creating the experience of seeing a tree. If I'm falling in love, that corresponds to brain activity. But the actual capacity to be aware, I don't think is created by the brain. I think that is actually a universal characteristic of the whole cosmos. And what has happened with human beings is we've evolved to a state where we are conscious that we are conscious. We are self-aware. But I don't think awareness comes out of matter. I could almost argue the other way around, that our experience of matter comes out of awareness. And that to me is a complete reversal of the current paradigm. And it's a hard thing to get across to people because, as you intimate, we hold on to our belief systems probably more doggedly than we hold on to anything else. We'll change jobs, we'll change houses, we'll change partners, we'll even change gender these days. But changing our fundamental belief system is difficult, whether it was a religious belief system or a scientific belief system. I think wasn't it Niels Bohr who said science changes not because scientists change their mind, but the old ones die out.
Yeah, I think that's true. I take it one step further and say, is science so fundamentally flawed that we can no longer use it? A few years ago, I had a chance to interview biologist Elizabeth Sahtouris. Have you ever heard of her?
Yeah, I know her well. Her well.
She's such a wonderful person. And, she's someone who's obviously looked at these kind of big picture, cross-cultural aspects of science. And I was just listening to the interview, and one of the things really kind of jumped out at me, and that is, we're the only culture in which our science assumes that we can observe our environment without affecting it. And I thought, wow, that's kind of interesting, kind of profound, because it is one of the fundamental assumptions. And we've known, you as a physicist can really speak to this, and I hope you will. I mean, we've known for at least the last 100 years that it's completely not true, right? I mean, quantum physics has told us, the observer effect has told us that, no, we cannot observe something without affecting it.
Okay, we've got a wealth of stuff to go ahead with here. Firstly, just to go back, I don't think science is fundamentally flawed. Well, first of all, let's draw a distinction between science as a process of arriving at truth, which is the scientific method, and the current scientific paradigm, which is the current worldview, which has been arrived at through the process. Now, the current worldview, I wouldn't say is fundamentally flawed. I would say it's limited. The current worldview works perfectly well when we're working out, weather patterns, how to design computer chips, which are basically based on quantum theory.
Engineering though, Peter, right? Is that science or is it engineering?
Well, the engineering is based on science. I mean, if you're doing engineering, you need to know, these days you need to really know about, say, metals, composites, their strengths, their weaknesses, how they work. And all of that comes out of science. So science is always behind technology, and then the technology leads to the engineering. So there's the science there. But what I want to say is that it's limited, and its limitation, its particular limitation is it doesn't include mind or consciousness within its scope. And that's when we start getting to those areas, we see its limits. It's a bit like saying, Newtonian physics was fine. It was limited. It's now just a special case of Einstein's physics, but we still drive our cars by Newtonian physics. We fly our GPS by Einsteinian physics, but Newtonian physics is perfectly good for driving down the road. And so yes. I would just say the science is limited, not flawed. I just want to make that point.
Great. Let's probe that a little bit further. And this is maybe just a hot button for me. And I love having a physicist on to talk about it with, because what you're really saying, it comes down to a matter of measurement, right? And how closely we want to measure things. I think what this mind-brain duality, this consciousness issue really says is that, we really can't measure things the way that we thought we could. And in the same way that when we moved from Newtonian physics to Einsteinian physics, we saw, Newtonian physics is really kind of an approximation. I think the move to consciousness does the same thing. We now have to realize that we have to put an asterisk by everything we measure because we haven't factored in consciousness. We don't know how many angels fit on the head of a needle, and yet we now have to seriously look at that question at least a little bit. We have to factor it in, and we don't factor it in. So, of course, I think there's still elements of science is okay as long as we look at it from my perspective as an engineer. But in terms of a form of answering these big picture questions of who we are, why are we here, I wonder if it really holds any promise of really getting us closer to that, or if it really is just a tool for engineers.
I think when it comes to those big questions, science is not going to help us. Not our current science anyway. No, it's not going to help us with those big questions. Why are we here? What's it about? It helps us understand how the world works, but it doesn't go for those bigger questions.
Well, it depends on who you talk to. There's a lot of folks that a lot of time have told us that science can give us those answers, and I think we've kind of built our culture around that, but I think that's part of what you've explored so wonderfully in your books and in many of your lectures is this intersection with what consciousness means for these larger spiritual kind of questions. Can you tell us how you made that leap?
I think it was through just observing my own experience in meditation. I think that's been a fundamental thing, is in a way recognizing that all of what we call the material world is actually an appearance in the mind. And in that sense, consciousness is really fundamental and comes before the material world, in the sense that all I ever know is my experience. And it's out of my experience that come my ideas and theories and models of what the world is like. And in that sense, just realizing that consciousness is absolutely fundamental. Without consciousness, there'd be no science. It all takes place in the mind. And yet, you could say it's the fundamental tool of science, and yet is totally ignored by science. And, the things you were pointing to earlier, like wave-particle duality, or how the collapse of the wave function, or what's very popular now, the whole idea of non-locality and entanglement, all of these in some way involve knowing, they involve observing, and yet we're trying to understand them in a model that excludes knowing and observing. And so we have this strange dichotomy that all our models are generated in consciousness. Everything we know is in consciousness. And then we forget that and think that the outside world is real and fixed. And we then try to understand it. To me, it's all back to front at the moment. And I think that's why physics is just going to dig itself deeper and deeper into trouble in this way.
Yeah, expound on that, because that's where I was really going.
Yeah.
I wonder if it's all, that sounds like a wonderful British expression, it's all back to front. I mean, is it so turned around that we really can't untangle it from that perspective? Well, expound on that a little bit.
Well, what I'm thinking, if you look at modern physics, look at both the very big the cosmological questions and the very small, the quantum questions, we are faced with mystery after mystery after mystery.
Right.
The Big Bang, black holes, dark matter, dark energy, all of this stuff, fundamental particles. And none of it works. Multiple universes, all this stuff. We have lots of questions, and we have lots of different models, whether it's string theory, as I say, or multiple universe theory, or modified Newtonian dynamic theory. I could list a dozen different theories, and they all sort of help out a bit. They all have problems. Nothing really solves the mystery. And I think that is because we are working within a paradigm that does not include consciousness. It just excludes consciousness. And I think we are going to be stuck with these, incomplete models until someone comes up with a model that actually includes consciousness. But that would be anathema for modern science. So it's going to take a real renegade to actually work in consciousness into the physical models. But I believe that's the only way we're going to get through this stage of modern science of just I say, full of mysteries and no true forerunner as an explanation.
And I even wonder if we can do it, because I think it again comes down to this measurement problem. We've kind of played with the measurement problem a little bit, and Einstein comes along and he says, oh, wow, everything's relative and we can only measure it down to this level, and Max Planck comes along, same thing, But we're still playing with, we can get there. Yeah. And I think what consciousness does is come around and change the whole game and say, no, you guys have been looking at this like a closed loop system, and it's not. It's open in some way that we'll never be able to pin it down. And I wonder, what kind of system of science, what kind of system of logic really comes out of that? And if it's so different from the assumptions that we have now, if it is even recognizable to us as quote unquote science.
Yes, I don't know what it's going to look like. That if I did, I'd be getting my Nobel Prize.
Yes, yes. Well, let me approach it this way, because you brought up the topic of meditation,
Yep.
which I think is fascinating. And I think there's some parallels to this discussion that we've had about science. And I'd kind of like to explore those with you.
Okay. Yeah.
You are a very experienced meditator and meditation teacher. Before we go too far, tell us a little bit about your background, because you are quite accomplished and quite well known as, like I say, not only a practitioner, but a teacher of meditation, are you not?
Yes. Yes. I don't know how well known, but I love meditation. As I said, it started me off on my journey 40 years ago, getting involved in transcendental meditation. And then I've explored other practices. For a while, I got quite involved in Buddhist teaching, mindfulness practices. And I've come to the point now of just looking, what is underlying all these practices, and what is the most efficient way of meditating. And one of the things I really got very early on in transcendental meditation was the whole notion of effortlessness, that any effort you put into meditation, any focusing the mind, actually just makes it more tense. Now, there's many, many traditions that teach effort. You've got to concentrate. It's very hard. And I just realized it's a closed loop there. If you think it's hard, you put effort into it. It doesn't work very well. You therefore think, I need to put more effort into it. It gets even harder. And you end up with teaching saying, oh, yes, it's going to take lifetimes of practice to get anywhere. My experience has been the less you try, the less effort, the faster the mind relaxes. And so what I've been working with in recent years is finding different ways, different like little sub-techniques that would sort of weed out even the tiniest seed of effort, the tiniest seed of wanting. So for me, it's about letting the mind fully relax. And through physical yoga and things, we can let the body relax. This is how do we let the mind totally relax? And in that total relaxation, it's about letting the attention relax. And then we just sink back into our own beingness, our own source. And that to me is the ultimate goal of meditation, whether you call it, the divine, the pure self, pure consciousness, being, pure spirit. It doesn't really matter, but it's coming back to that state of essence of stillness. And I'm just interested in how we can do that so much more easily and rapidly. And that's what I'm teaching these days, is going against I have a lot of friends who are deeply involved in traditions, and we have debates about this. So they say, oh, all this preparation is necessary, and you need all these other techniques, and only when you've accomplished this. And the groups I run, I'm just finding, no, I think we can go straight there. And that's what I'm interested in, because in these times, I think we need some sort of practice of stilling the mind. So important in our culture. And let's fine tune how we do that and make it more efficient. So that's really what I'm interested in, is that how to have that letting go just really happen as easily as possible.
Right. That's fascinating. Of course, there's always the interplay there, again, like the parallels in science, but here it's between, this big mind and this little mind, or the monkey mind, or all these things, which I think is kind of a derogatory term that I don't like so much. But,
right.
What I wonder, as we're talking about this, is that when we talk about meditation practice and as a practitioner and techniques and efficiency, I get all that, and that's very pragmatic. But I wonder if there isn't a big paradigm shift there too, because to me, the paradigm shift is that you are not your thoughts, right? I mean, That is fundamentally what it's all about.
Yes.
And once we take that in, which is really, really hard to do, but once we take that in, everything changes, because we just have to look at whatever technique we're applying, whatever method we're using. It's not us, because we are just in this container, but there's this larger consciousness that we're interacting with that we didn't even realize we were interacting with.
Yes, and I think this is so important, and I think this is something more and more people are realizing these days. It's like, you're right, I am not my thoughts. What I am is that knowing, which is conscious of the thought. The thoughts are appearing in awareness, but we tend to identify with the thinking. But no, I am not the thought. I am that space of awareness in which it is appearing. In the same way, I am that space of awareness within which the meditation is happening. And so much meditation is doing something, trying to change something, make something happen. And yet, that is the little ego I trying to do something, whereas that true self is there knowing the experience of meditating. It's like we keep coming back to this, that beingness is always present. We don't have to go anywhere or get anything or make anything happen. It's about almost like softening the attention. Mm-hmm. And as we soften the attention, we just recognize, this sense of being we call I has been there all my life. Right. I just didn't recognize it. Right. And I am the same I was when I was a teenager, when I was 30 years old, as I was yesterday. It's always that same sense of being. What my thoughts are different, my values, my goals in life, my feelings, all of that's changing the whole time and hopefully evolving. But the I that is there at the center of it all is that still center, just the observing of all of this. Mm-hmm. And I think, it's that which people are recognizing. We don't have to go anywhere or do anything or even have any technique. I think, I was reading a teacher the other day who said, in the end, the value of all teachers and techniques is you come to the point of realizing you do not need teachers or techniques. Mm-hmm. And it's a paradoxical journey. And I think many of us are on that. I know I was, I've been through various practices. And then in the end, for me, the practice is just simply noticing that awareness, which is always there, and not following the thought. You talk about monkey mind. Yes, the mind goes here and there. It goes from one thought to another. One thought triggers another. In meditation, for me, it's simply a matter of just say, okay, when that happens, I'm not following you. This is not the time to follow a thought. I'll do that later. The rest of life, I can follow my thoughts. Right now, it's like, thank you, not now. And if you don't follow the thought, you gradually take the fuel away from them. You're not adding fuel to the fire. And the thoughts just gradually die down on their own if you don't follow them. So for me, the essence of, my practice is not following the thought and just noticing the awareness that's always there.
Wonderful. Yeah, but it's tricky, isn't it? Because anyone who's tried this knows we're always interacting with that big mind, little mind thing. We cannot get away from it. We're in this body. And I think it's those little moments of realization that I think propel us just a little bit further.
Yeah.
I always think of this experience that I had as a dad, really, a few years ago when my oldest daughter was a little bit younger. She had this fascination, like a lot of kids do, with, these pizza parlors where you go and you win these little tickets in the machines, and then you go cash in your tickets for these trinkets that just aren't worth anything. The economics of it, again, as a kind of an entrepreneurial guy, it just always kind of drove me nuts. I'm like, hon, we can go right over here to the store and buy that thing for a fraction of what you spent on it. Yeah. But I remember so clearly standing back a little bit and seeing her peering into, the glass case and deciding what she had. And even though she's my daughter and I love her, I had these thoughts of, oh my gosh, this kid, how naive, And then suddenly it dawned on me, this is me. This is my life. This is what I do. I do all this stuff to get these little tickets so I can cash them in for these little trinkets so that I can continue to play this little game. And there's this whole other thing going on that I rarely access. And when I do, all the other stuff looks just like cashing in tickets for little toys.
Little plastic toys, yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a cultural hypnosis here. I mean, your daughter's sort of fallen into that cultural hypnosis, which has been, it's deliberately done. I mean, because there's people producing the trinket machines so that they can make money for themselves. But I mean, the hypnosis is that if we just got the right thing, whatever it is we're being told we haven't got, we lack something, get this, you'll feel okay. And it works a little bit, your daughter gets her trinket and she feels okay for, I don't know, 5 minutes, whatever. In our lives, we play these games, we get our bits of paper and we go and exchange them for something else, and we feel okay. We buy, new piece of clothing. We feel great. And the hypnosis is, we think it's the getting the trinket or whatever it is, the friendship, the great movie, the gourmet meal. We think that's what's made us happy. It's actually, ironically, the opposite. We create discontent. We haven't got something. Your daughter's sitting there. She's, there's a sense of discontent. But I'm going to get something. There's something missing, but I'm going to feel okay when I get it. We create discontent, and that makes us, we don't feel so good. And then when we get it, the discontent dissolves and we feel good. But we think it's the trinket that makes us feel good, instead of realizing we have temporarily stopped creating discontent, but only temporarily, because then again, we meet something else, or some other advertisement, something comes up, we read something, it's like, oh, something else I haven't got, something else I need. And that to me is what, in Indian thought is called the wheel of samsara. It's that endless, it literally means to wander on endlessly. We wander on from one thing to another, just hoping if we finally got enough of the right goodies, we'd be in everlasting peace.
So I wonder, as you're saying that, I keep going back to the earlier part of our conversation, and there seem to be a lot of parallels there. I'm not sure I can draw them all out. What are the parallels between that process? It echoes so many of the things we were talking about with science, and science not being able to kind of find itself out of this mess, because what it's doing, in the same way that you're saying we're kind of creating this need, this false need, in order to fill this false need, it seems to me that that's kind of what science is doing in a way. We're creating or structuring problems that we can solve inside of a paradigm that isn't real. So we're creating, here's a little mystery that we can go and solve, and but it's not really related to these bigger problems, the problems that we really always asked science from the beginning, which, you kind of said out of hand that science can't answer the big picture questions. Who are we? Why are we here?
Yeah.
I would go back and say that's all we ever wanted science to do in the first place. Why have we spent all this time on all these plastic trinkets and all this other stuff? All we ever wanted from science was, who are we? Why are we here?
Right. And if you take that actually all the way back, the very, very first science was astronomy. And it was looking at the sky at night when we didn't have television. All we had was the campfire and the stars. And it was the charting of the stars and the wondering what was going on in the cosmos, which was the why are we here? That was the beginning of science, working all that, looking at the stars, looking at the sky, looking out into space. No, I don't think it can answer those questions and never will. I think science is, where science goes, science leads to technology always. When we discover something, it's then, okay, how can we use this to make something, to do something? And then that technology falls into the service of this belief system that we just have to make things right to be happy. And so we start building technologies based on a scientific understanding of how to make things more efficient, how to make our computers boot up faster, bigger memory, whatever it is, how to get our cars more efficient, how to produce whatever it is, bit better food. It's always ultimately about human satisfaction. So technology feeds into how to make things more efficient, how to make us happier, how to relieve pain and suffering, whatever it is, some of which is, very honorable, but it's falling into this basic trap that fulfillment comes from how the world is, from what we have or do. And so we're seeking to make the world better. Whereas just about every spiritual teaching on the planet says, in one way or another, fulfillment comes from how you see the world, how you interpret the world. It's not the way the world is, it's our response to it that determines how we feel. And that science doesn't look at, except maybe in some areas of psychology it's beginning to.
It's interesting. You've now thrown the spirituality track down on the table as well, and mixing metaphors there. But that's something you've done a wonderful job of trying to cross over and cross-fertilize. But we always have a tendency to want to kind of pull those things apart. And I wonder, in the way that you just did that, is you just seamlessly went from science's inability to answer these questions to talking about how spiritual traditions, and in particular in the East, contemplative traditions, traditions that just really go within and say, I can, by contemplating this consciousness mechanism that I have, maybe arrive at some questions. How do we transcend and make that new paradigm leap to allow us to bring in that information that we have from these traditions and also from our own observations, our own contemplative work?
Wow, you ask good, great questions. We just need another couple of hours. Okay, first of all, I just like to say, I distinguish between spirituality and religion. I think all the great religions started from deep spiritual insights, spiritual awakenings of people, and they had a realization which is almost this sort of common. It's what Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. It comes up again and again and again, and it's about things we talk about. It's about letting go. It's about discovering our true nature. It's about realizing the love that is there within us. It's about not chasing material things. There's many different aspects to it. And then it gets absorbed by the culture. It gets translated into different languages, and bits get added on, bits get lost. And we end up with lots of different religions which look very different, so much so that they start arguing about which one is right. And I'm interested in what is it underneath them all that's right. There's a common core there. And that, to me, is what I call spirituality, the spiritual traditions. There's a common core. And now remind me the second part of your question again.
Well, I think there's also a distinction that I'd like to hear you make or draw out between the contemplative traditions and the spiritual spark, because the spiritual spark almost seems by definition to come from the outside. And we don't know, because once we get into that territory, once we cross this chasm and say, okay, consciousness is not solely a product of the brain, I think we all realize that kind of all bets are off. We've kind of gone into a zone where we're just kind of walking our way through. But I think that's something that you've explored a little bit in this crossing over from a very kind of strict, formalized way of looking at it to a spiritual kind of divine insight way. And in between almost, I think, sits this contemplative, no, I'm not going to consider necessarily outside spiritual influences, although those might come in, but I'm just going to kind of go within and be quiet.
Yes, and that's been very much, my approach, supported by, what other people who've done the same. There's a lot of guidance and there from people who've trod that path and gone a lot further down it than I have. And just another point here, coming back to science, I think, science is studying the phenomenal world, what it calls the material world. And I would say the spiritual traditions are studying experience itself, the arising of experience. And the two are different fields. I don't see any conflict between science and spirituality. Only when you think the spiritual is talking about the material world, then there's conflict. You start talking about how the universe began. I think the spiritual traditions are talking about what goes on inside us. And that's where the contemplative traditions, I think, are really valuable. It's about pausing and being willing to observe what is actually happening in one's own mind. And so, we touched on thoughts. Most of us spend our time wrapped up in thoughts, what you call the monkey mind. But when you pause and the thoughts begin to settle down, you can begin to notice how a thought comes into being. You can notice that tiny, tiny seed and how that grows and how this sense of identity begins to get built into the thought. And as you notice how that's happening, you can see what's happening And you can then begin to deconstruct it. And in that deconstructing, we just return back to that, what I call that sense of being, pure self, whatever. And there you start meeting something which I think can be given, the name divine. It meets that sort of our idea of the divine in many ways. In that sense, it is the peace of God. There's that love of God. It is omnipresent, always there, unchanging. It is forgiving, all those qualities. And then, if in some traditions you would then make that a contact with something outside you, beyond you, that sort of God, or it is something that is transcendent within you. How you interpret that, I think, varies within your culture. But I think that is the universal experience, the universal awakening of realizing almost everything we're looking for, in essence, is already there in ourselves, but it's veiled by the thinking, the planning, the doing, the wanting, the wishing, the hoping, the avoiding, and all the stuff we get into fills the mind up. And that very quiet level of peace, contentment is just veiled, and we don't notice it. And that, to me, is where the contemplation comes in, of just being willing to sit and notice what's actually going on.
So, Peter, it's been quite a ride that you're on, and you're obviously still going strong. What kind of projects are you working on now? Any books? I know you still write. I read a post recently in the Huffington Post. What's going on with you right now?
Too many things. I'm working on a new video on the primacy of consciousness. I've got a video on YouTube, which was just a lecture I gave a few years ago, an hour and 10-minute lecture, which has sort of gone viral. It's got over 1/3 hits on the primacy of consciousness, which was not made, as a good video. It's just me lecturing with slides and things, but it's got so much good response. I'm now working on collapsing that down to something like a 20-minute video, really refining the argument, taking it deeper, and producing a whole lot of new visuals to go with it. That's what I'm currently working on.
Great. I've seen that video. Yeah, it's great.
This is going to be a remake of it and a refining of it, and trying to make it a lot more popular. I think people love it, so I want to go for sort of more popular outreach with the animation and things. I've got some new meditation courses I'm doing online. I've got one which has been quite popular. I want to make an advanced version of that. I've got I talk about books. I'm not sort of writing books so much these days. It takes so long to do them. And then there's the whole publishing cycle and the promotion cycle, and things are changing so fast. I'm working on going either straight to audiobook or straight to ebook on several subjects. I've got one on letting go, which is halfway done, book on letting go. Another book, which is almost a sequel to that, on seeking, but how the seeking self arises in consciousness, and just an understanding of how pure consciousness, in a way, separates into a separate sense of self and the rest of the world, and how that separate sense of self ends up seeking something. So that's something I'm excited by myself at the moment.
Just so people know, if someone's interested in your online meditation training, what's the easiest way for them to find that? Is through your website?
The easiest way to find anything of mine is through my website, which is peterrussel.com. And just make sure you have 2 L's on the Russell, because otherwise you end up on some typo squatter. But it's Peter Russel, just my name, Peter Russel, with 2 L's on the Russell. And there you can access the meditation course. There's links to all my videos, my blogs, everything. You'll find it through the site in one way or another. My newsletter, everything. That's the portal to access stuff on YouTube, whatever it is. And if you're on my newsletter, then you get notifications of new things as they come out, or you subscribe to my YouTube channel, whatever.
I've been to the website. There's just a vast amount of information there, some great stuff. And those YouTube videos you mentioned are definitely worth watching. So I hope people check those out as well. So, Peter, thanks again for joining me. It's been great talking to you on Skeptiko. I know we've kind of meandered around some different topics, but I guess I was serving my own needs there of interest in this idea of the intersection between science and meditation and between the paradigm shifts that you've pointed out with consciousness.
That's been great. I mean, I don't mind wandering around. I love it. I think we've covered a lot of good stuff, and we could go on for hours on any of it, but it's been great.
Thanks again to Peter Russel for joining me today on Skeptiko. One question to tee up from this interview, and I'm going to circle back and hit this question a couple times on upcoming shows, and that is, do we need to rethink some of our basic assumptions about science, like this measurement issue that I was talking about, given what we now know about consciousness? Is this the elephant in the room? Is that we can't really measure much of anything in science if we can't measure consciousness? Is consciousness the asterisk at the end of our measurements? Does that fundamentally change science in some way that we haven't fully recognized? You can tell that's my proposition as much as it is a question, but I'd love to get your feedback and your thoughts on it. Of course, the place to do that is at the Skeptiko website at skeptiko.com. There you'll find links to all of our previous shows that you can download for free or subscribe through iTunes. You can also find an email, Facebook link to me, and then the link to the forum or the comment section of the website where you can join in a discussion with other people and tell us what you think. Number of interesting shows coming up. Many are piling up in my inbox. I'm just having trouble getting them out on time. I have other stuff going on, but I will at least stay with this once every other week schedule and hopefully slip a couple more in as well. Also making nice progress on the book and hope to have more information on that for you shortly. That's going to do it for this time. Take care. Bye for now.